My name is Marcy Harris, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Mass Humanities, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event with Joseph Stiglitz and Robert Kuttner, discussing Stiglitz's new book, The Great Divide: Unequal Societies and What We Can Do About Them. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Mass Humanities. Mass Humanities supports programs that use history, literature, philosophy, and the other disciplines to enhance and improve civic life for the people of Massachusetts. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and best-selling author of The Price of Inequality, Freefall, and Globalization and Its Discontents. He is a columnist for the New York Times and Project Syndicate, and his work has appeared in numerous other publications, including Politico and The Atlantic. He is joined tonight by Robert Kuttner, the co-founder and co-editor of The American Prospect. A longtime columnist for Business Week, Robert also continues to write for the Boston Globe and is the co-founder for the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. In The Great Divide, Joseph argues that inequality is a choice, the cumulative result of unjust policies and misguided priorities. Joseph exposes in full America's inequality, its dimensions, its causes, and its consequences for the nation, and how we can embrace real solution to reinvest in the American people. We are so very pleased to be hosting them tonight. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Stiglitz and Robert Kuttner.
Joe, you are such a hero. You're one of the rare truth tellers who actually has influence, and for that we should all be grateful. I want to ask you about inequality. Thanks to your work and that of others, inequality is at last on the political agenda, and your work suggests that this is not just a matter of the fight for 15, it's a much deeper structural set of problems ranging from capital markets to financialization of the economy to the lack of countervailing institutions that connects economic inequality to political inequality. Say more about that and tell us what it will take for the argument that you have already won as a matter of economics to become a winning politics.
Well, first, I think we have to be clear that we have more inequality than any of the other advanced countries. And that in itself tells something, because it says it's not just about economic forces. It's not inexorable, inevitable forces of, because those forces are operating on both sides of the Atlantic in all the advanced countries. But the way we've shaped those forces has led the United States to have more inequality and less inequality of opportunity than any of the other countries. So the next question is, what are these driving forces? What are the forces that are shaping the American economy to have such a high level of inequality? And the bottom line is there are just a lot. And it goes all the way from the laws of corporate governance, antitrust, bankruptcy laws even, to our education systems, to the laws and regulations that affect labor unions, the labor markets, to the laws that affect, to the tax laws that provide incentives. So it's basically all the incentive structures and all the constraints that are operating in the economy. And it used to be, say before 1980, that we had sort of a balance. Galbraith would describe this as countervailing powers. So you would have a tendency of corporations and CEOs to want to get more pay, but you had unions who said we need to have better pay for our workers, and we have to make sure that there's enough money left over to reinvest in the economy because we want to be sure that there are jobs. Well, beginning around 1980, we lost that kind of balance. We deregulated the financial system. We went to what is called shareholder capitalism, which says, don't worry about all the other stakeholders, the workers, the communities, just focus on the shareholders. And most of the time that meant focus on the CEO himself. And the result of this was we got a short-sighted capitalism that looked just at tomorrow, and we got a capitalism, a market economy that was growing more slowly, growing with greater instability as evidenced by the 2008 crisis, and most importantly, growing apart. And that's, of course, the title, The Great Divide. We had a part of our society that was doing very, very well, and another part, vast majority, that was not. And that's highlighted by, again, a couple of numbers that I just find just amazing. Officially, the recession was supposed to end in 2009. In the first 3 years after the end of the recession, 95% of the gains went to the top 1%. So the vast majority of Americans didn't know what the Obama administration and the Federal Reserve were telling them. They were saying the recession was over. They felt just as badly off as they were before. Another statistic that I find just amazing is that the median income, median is half above, half below. So we're talking about what's happening to the middle class. We used to think of ourselves as a middle class society. What was happening to the middle? Median income, adjusted for inflation in the United States, is lower today than it was a quarter century ago. When I talk in China about what's happened, this was the period during which their incomes increased eightfold. 8 times. And we're saying here in America, the average American had his income totally stagnant. In terms of males, the effects in different demographic groups are different. And one demographic group that's still important in our society are males. The median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. Now that's just an astounding statistic. And if you're not a college graduate, things are far worse. I mean, incomes have really, really plummeted.
Now, you say in the book, we talk about we went through this change, we went through that change. You say in the book that it's partly ideology, it's partly special interest politics, but it's also the fact that government has been captured by elites to serve elites. One of Galbraith's countervailing institutions was democratic government. And our Marxist friends used to say that the state was the executive committee of the ruling class. And back when we were young, that sounded almost laughable because you could say, well, no, the state actually is helping the middle class. It's helping the working class. Well, today, when Republicans as well as Democrats appoint secretaries of the Treasury from Goldman, it no longer sounds quite so ludicrous to ask the question of who the state is really serving. What will it take to pry the state loose again so that government is the instrument of regular people and not the instrument of Wall Street?
Well, let me just first reiterate the point you made, because it was really reflected in the title of my first popular article in this area. It was an article I wrote in Vanity Fair. My first article I wrote on inequality, I wrote almost 50 years ago. It was part of my thesis, and it was published in Econometrica. Didn't get a big readership. I can't figure out why. But in Vanity Fair, it went viral. And the title of that was, and really reflecting what you just said, it was of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. And it was really saying that something's happened to our democracy. And I think the moment that made that so clear was the crisis, the 2008 crisis, where you had, you won't say a cabal,
You could say cabal.
yeah, the Secretary of Treasury, the head of the New York Fed, and the head of the Fed getting together to save the banks that had caused the crisis, and deciding not to do almost anything about the homeowners who were losing their homes and who've been preyed upon by the banks. And then you ask, what was going on? And you realize that Geithner, who then became Obama's Secretary Treasurer, had been appointed head of the New York Fed by a committee that consisted of the chairman of the board of AIG, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, I think. And basically, the people who he rescued were the people who gave him his job. And if this had happened in a developing country, we would be saying, oh, what was wrong with their governance? And we would, talk about corruption. But in America, it's part of the American way of life. Now, you asked the question, what can we do about it? I think there are the immediate problem is that in our system, more than almost any other democracy, economic inequality gets translated into political inequality. And it's gotten worse. Citizens United, all these issues. And I noticed in the paper today, at least in Washington, there was a big article about how campaign finance reform is entering into the campaign. So I think people are beginning to get aware that our political system has been corrupted and is the vehicle through which inequality gets exacerbated, because the economic inequality leads to political inequality, leads to more and more economic inequality. So the first thing is, in my mind, is reforms of the revolving doors, the campaign finance, the political structure. But then the obvious question is, how do you get that? And I think the answer, in some sense, is every election, at least the hope that there'll be enough civil society activity, enough concern of citizens, enough discussions of this kind that people get exercised and it gets elevated to at least towards the top of the political agenda.
I want to ask you about international things because one of the things that makes you so valuable is you don't simply talk about inequality in the United States. You have very much of a global perspective, and it's not a naive global perspective in that it simply argues for more liberal trade. You've been very much involved in the conversations about Greece. If the United States is pursuing perverse policies, the Europeans are pursuing even more perverse policies. The last week or two, there have been leaks and counter leaks about whether Greece is going to go over the cliff, whether it's going to have to leave the Eurozone, whether this game of chicken between the Greek government and the Germans and the EU. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Are you cautiously optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Is this is the 100th anniversary of World War I? Are we going to have the same kind of miscalculation that's going to lead to another European catastrophe?
Unfortunately, I think it's very likely that will happen. In the last couple of weeks, I had the chance to spend a lot of time with the Greek finance minister. We spent only a half day together. I had a public interview with him, and that interview started trending and it was only forced down by Hillary's announcement of her candidacy, but that's okay. And I also spent several hours with the Schäuble, the German finance minister, and last night I had a chance to talk to the president of one of the European countries. And I got to tell you, this is a train wreck very likely to happen. That you might call it an accident, but at this juncture, it's hardly an accident. It's almost going to be an event. It's only, I think, going to take somebody like Angela Merkel to come in at a in a statesman-like way to say, she doesn't want to see the headlines, Germany ruins Europe for the third time in 101 years, and that's what it's coming down to, because the difference in their views of what is happening are so large. Their views of what is good economics Now, actually, the finance minister of Greece is a good economist, and in the case of Germany, well, I won't say anything. But what I wanted also highlight, to bring this a little bit back to the United States, what has gone on in Europe is an exaggerated version of what has happened in America. And so in a way, we can look at Europe and see a little bit in exaggerated form. What they've done has been to focus on a worry about budget deficits. They've had extreme austerity, cutting back on government expenditure. They have a central bank whose mandate is only to focus on inflation. They're not allowed to worry about unemployment growth. Now, we had a central bank that, in fact, before the crisis, focused mainly on inflation, even though it had a mandate to focus on other things. The result of this is that large numbers of countries in Europe are in depression. In Greece, the unemployment rate is over 25%. And the youth unemployment rate is over 60%. And it's been that way since 2008, 2009. Now, can you imagine? You graduate from college, you've worked hard, you played by the rules, and you don't have a job, and none of your friends have a job. The children of none of your friends have jobs. It is a disaster. They are destroying the future. But Greece has sort of become the poster child, but other countries are almost equally bad. Spain is a country that had a surplus before the crisis. And yet, Germany, the Troika, imposed this kind of contraction. And contraction has led to an unemployment rate in Spain of 25% and youth unemployment of 50%. And of course, when that happens is government budgets get cut back, jobs are cut back, wages start to fall. Per capita income in most of the countries in Europe is lower than it was in 2007 and 8. So they're going towards a lost decade. And even Germany, the best performing country, and it sort of prides itself, its growth since the recession has been a little over 1%. We would give that a D-. Right. And yet they're boasting about how well they're doing. And the bottom 30% of Germany is actually worse off than it was before, so they haven't even shared in that little growth. So to me, I think it's important for us to look at Europe as what could happen if you really get the policies wrong.
We may elect a Democratic president of the United States in 18 months. We've had 3 Democratic presidents in a row who were centrists on a good day, certainly when it comes to financialization of the economy, when it comes to whether they were willing to be robustly Keynesian. I think the one really left-of-center chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under the last 3 presidents was you, and that was almost anomalous. What will it take for the next Democratic president of the United States, and let's not name any names, to pursue a more progressive course?
Well, I think the world today is different from where it was when Carter, when Clinton, when Obama got elected. It's different in several ways. First, we have finally, everybody, both the left and the right, have recognized the importance of inequality. There is broad recognition that the financial sector has not served our society, our economy. And we saw that so dramatically in 2008. Clinton promoted deregulation of the financial sector. I have to say, when I was chairman, I opposed repeal of Glass-Steagall. I opposed the deregulation of derivatives. And I don't know if it was luck, but as long as I was there, it didn't happen. But when I left, things sort of took another turn. So And we now know that those were mistakes, and very bad mistakes. But it's not just that they were mistakes in leading to more volatility in the economy. They also gave the financial sector more opportunity to engage in exploitive practices, discrimination, predatory lending, market manipulation, all the things that actually undermined our economy. And this has now become, widely accepted. Paul Volcker, who is I would call a centrist, but even Paul Volcker, says that the financial sector, none of the innovations of the financial sector have led to improved economic performance in any dimension except the ATM machine. And then I point out that the ATM machine was a British innovation, not an American innovation. So there's not a single innovation that you can point to that had led to greater, improved economic performance, greater growth. So I think we're in a different place now. And so I think the debate that is going on is going to inevitably move the Democratic candidate, whoever that is, towards a more progressive agenda. But how far, where that's going to be is going to be determined by in a way, the way the debate goes in the country, the political debate in the next 3 months, 6 months.
In this book, you rehabilitate a wonderful old-fashioned economist term, rent-seeking, which, as you explain, is in plain English means the use of monopoly power to feather the nest of the monopolist, but not the consumer. And you look around the economy, you can find all kinds of examples where instead of innovation leading to price competition and price breaks for the consumer, it leads to more money for the rent seeker, more money for the corporations, less competition, whether you're talking about cable or cellular or hospital charges or, what happens is deregulation leads to more concentration, leads to more monopoly rents. It doesn't lead to more innovation. Do you think, is that too esoteric a concept, or did people at some level know they're being ripped off if a political leader were to take that and run with it?
Oh, I think they understand that. Anybody who has a cell phone or has a cable TV knows about what it's like to deal with the cell phone or the cable company, and they know that they don't have much choice. This is not the competitive economy that they read about in their elementary economics course, where there are large numbers of firms competing and each of them is a price taker. That's not the description of the modern economy. In the case of cell phone, you can go from maybe one to another, but they're equally bad. Name it airline, you may have 2 or 3 going between, but they're all, you don't have much choice, really. And in cable, typically no choice. But when you look at it at the macro level, they also, I think, understand this. So another statistic that I find just very, very striking is over the last 40 years, the average productivity of American workers has doubled. Average wages have stagnated. Now you have to ask, in a competitive market, wages and productivity move along. And you look across countries where there's more competition, you actually see that. And that was the way it used to be in the United States. Productivity goes up, wages go up. But workers are working hard, productivity is going up, wages are stagnant. And part of that, I don't want to say all, but at least part of that has to do with the increase in market power. It's not just a monopoly, but it's a broader kind of market power. And it's increasing the market power of these corporations and weakening the market power of the offsetting effects of say, unions.
Well, and one of the hallmarks of the increased market power of corporations has been changes in the structure of labor markets. There's a nice book by David Wild called The Fissured Economy. I did a piece called The TaskRabbit Economy. And the point is, there is distance between the ultimate employer and any responsibility for the employee, and you have more contract, part-time, temp, inferior kinds of work that are not old-fashioned payroll employment, where you know who you're working for, and the structure of labor laws gives you some protection because they're based on the assumption of payroll employment. Now, some of that reflects corporate power. Some of it reflects technology, but it's creative corporate use of technology to distance the corporation from the actual person doing the job. This is also very tricky. What do you do about that? I mean, is full employment a cure for that? Is regulation a cure for that? What?
Well, I mean, as I say, I think full employment is the most important policy for raising wages and protecting ordinary Americans. And the fact is that even though the official unemployment rate now is around 5.2% or something like that, the fact is there's a lot of disguised unemployment,
right,
like labor force participation, that is to say the fraction of people working is the lowest it's been in 30 years. And it's not because people don't want to work. It's because they've given up looking for a job because there are no jobs. And you know, if you've looked for a job for 2, 3, 4 years, no wonder you're discouraged. And this is just a fact that a lot of people don't understand. The way we collect statistics, when we say a person is unemployed, what we mean is that they don't have a job and they're actively looking for a job. So these guys who have given up looking are not unemployed by the statistics. And if you're working 5 hours a week, you're not unemployed by the statistics. But of course, you're not really employed. And most of these people want jobs and can't get them. So macroeconomic policy is I think, very important. But it's not the only thing. I think that there are aspects of technology that are contributing to this, the creation of the disintegration of firms, and that played an important role when you had, say, janitors being hired by the firm.
Right.
There was a kind of cohesiveness that the firm would worry about, and the magnitude of wage disparities was much lower than when we disintegrate the firm. So that's clear. So the question is, what do we do to try to countervail that? I think one of the things that we have to do is to reconceptualize the way unions work, for instance. So they have to be able to organize across, like taxi cab drivers. They didn't used to do that. And firms have tried to create self-employment to say employees are self-employed, right, to avoid taxes. And we need to basically figure out how to circumscribe that. And I think we can do that.
One of the many things you've written about in this book and elsewhere is the environment. Is there a kind of strategy to put people back to work by investing in the next generation of clean technology? Has it gone beyond a point of no return? And does that have political legs? You would think that would be the most obvious thing in the world. Let's invest in deferred infrastructure, create good jobs, put people back to work, have a green transition. Why doesn't that argument have more political legs?
So you raise a number of issues. Let me try to parse it out into a couple parts. First, the United States right now can borrow at a negative real interest rate. Real interest rate is the interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So it's the real cost of capital is this real interest rate. The United States can borrow at a negative real interest rate. We have lots of investments in technology, infrastructure, education, that pay very large returns, 20, 30, 40%. If you were a business and you had these opportunities to borrow at a minus, not just zero, but a negative number, and you have returns like that and you didn't invest, everybody would say you're stupid. But the US is not doing that. So the question, in part, is why? And I think it's, again, coming back to a theme, it's the politics. Anybody who's really interested in the strength of the U.S. would say, okay, if you borrow, every firm borrows when they have a good investment opportunity. The asset side of the balance sheet goes up more than the liability because of the value, the return you're going to get on those investments. But unfortunately, the conservatives would rather see a weak economy and a weak government than to see the government actually deal with some of the problems that we're facing in almost a costless way. So that's the underlying problem. And anybody who comes into New York City knows the problem of the lack of infrastructure in New York. So I can testify on that particular point. Climate change is, I think, a real issue, and the consequences are becoming not only more imminent, but increasingly more irreversible. That is to say, the extent of climate change, global warming, it's not just global warming, because it's also weather variability, hurricanes, and extreme events are related to the concentration of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, in the atmosphere, and that's been going up. You know, you look at those charts, it's going up every year, and so it's going to become more and more difficult to put a cap on that. Now, this is where you can see a way in which our economy has really gone astray. Talk about innovation. What do we really need innovation to do? We need innovation to protect the planet, to save the planet. What are our firms doing, our short-sighted firms? What they're doing is innovation that creates more unemployment. We don't need more unemployed people. We do need to protect the environment. So how are they doing that? Now, all of you have probably seen this. You go into a grocery store, you go into a drugstore, and you have an automatic teller. You know, one of these machines, very expensive, but, and this goes back to the Fed as one of the major institutions, what has it done? It's lowered interest rates to close to zero. That means the cost of capital for those firms, usually big firms that can get access to capital, becomes very low. And what we're doing is increasing unemployment and ensuring that we have a almost jobless recovery. So in a way, it illustrates how a mismanaged economy can simultaneously not address the problem of climate change and create more inequality. Now, if we were doing the right thing, this would be a great time to invest in climate mitigation, to make the investments to improve insulation. Clearly, this building needs better insulation. We need to restructure our cities, our public transportation. We have to move away from automobiles to more public transportation. There are an enormous number of things that we could do, profitable investments, that would create more employment, drive up wages, reduce inequality, and enhance the environment and our future. But unfortunately, that's not where we're going.
Another thing you've written about in this book and in several previous books is globalization. I recall you were on a high-level commission about 10 years ago, sponsored by the ALO for a fairer globalization. A lot of my colleagues experience globalization as meaning outsourcing, driving down wages, tax and regulatory arbitrage, race to the bottom, where capital plays off one government, one set of regulations against another. What would a fair globalization look like?
Well, let me just first mention that globalization is an arena that illustrates the general point that I've been raising. not just inexorable economic forces. It's how we shape those. It's how our policies and politics. So yes, transportation costs and communication costs have come down. And that could have increased opportunities in a way that everybody would benefit. But the way we shape globalization has contributed to the growth of inequality. And recent studies have shown that the way we manage globalization in the United States has led to surges of imports and those places where there are those surges of imports that were producing the goods that were competing have had lower wages and more unemployment. And so, 15 years ago, there was a debate about the relationship between trade and inequality. Today, that debate is pretty well over. I mean, we know that mismanaged globalization does increase inequality, does put downward pressure on wages. Now, what that's related to is a very big issue that's being debated right now in the United States, which is TPP and what's called the Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, to give a blank check to the administration, the USTR, but it's a blank check for a number of years. So it says not only do you give this administration a blank check, but if there happened to be another administration that was, shall I say, even less trustworthy, things could get much worse. So they want a blank check. What is so striking right now is that the U.S. Trade Representative, the administration, won't even tell us what its negotiating position is. We know, not because they've told us, but because it's leaked. And WikiLeaks has provided an important function. So we know a lot about what it is. But it's even worse than that. There was a court that a few years ago said that the Freedom of Information Act gave American citizens the right to know what our trade negotiators are asking. And so what does the trade USTR do? It stamped it secret so that they couldn't get it. So they're trying to undermine what even courts have said we have the right to know. Now, from what we've seen, this trade agreement is not about jobs, although it probably will destroy some jobs, but it's mainly not about jobs. It's really about making, undermining our regulatory system, undermining regulations that protect the environment, protect workers, protect consumers. It's trying to do what I call an end run around our political process in doing that, creating a adjudication process that allows in private arbitration, in a secret arbitration effectively, any corporation to sue the US government, and a similar thing in other countries, on all kinds of regulations. And this is not just a hypothetical. I'll come back to that in a second, but there's one other thing I want to mention, and then I'll come back to this particular provision. And your senator has been very outspoken about this issue. But the other one is, and I find it very strange from the Obama administration, because the hallmark legislation was Obamacare, which was intended to lower healthcare costs and make it more accessible. Well, there are provisions in this trade agreement that would raise the price of drugs. By reducing competition from generics, we did a national compromise on trying to balance off the incentives for innovation and the access to cheap goods. It was called the Hatch-Waxman Act that balanced it to 87% of all drugs now are generics, and it's kept their costs down, even though they're higher than anywhere else. But this trade agreement is trying to do a hatchet job on that and basically make generics impossible or almost impossible to compete for a much longer time with the drug companies. But let me just say one thing about the judicial process for companies suing, and I said it is not only a theoretical possibility. Essentially, an identical provision is contained in agreements that that have been made with Uruguay and with Australia and other countries. And right now, there is what I call the 21st century opium war going on. I don't know if you know the history. 19th century, one of the first trade initiatives of the West was to open up the market in China for opium. There was a trade imbalance then, and to rectify the trade imbalance, Britain was very clever and figured out it could pick up the ships that were getting the China and porcelain and other things from China, bring them back to the West. They were empty, and they would stop along the way in India, get opium, and then deliver it to China. And opium is a wonderful product from the point of view of a business. As I do a little teaching in the business school. One of the best products for business is repeat purchases, and we call customer loyalty. And opium has a high degree of customer loyalty until they die, unfortunately. China figured out this was really, really bad, and they said, "We don't want your opium. Thank you, but no thank you." And the West went to war, 2 wars, to make sure that China, it was a basic human right, we say, that we have the right to sell opium to you. Well, the United States is now doing something very similar in these other countries, and that's why I call it the 21st century opium. It's not opium, it's cigarettes. And I hope none of you smoke, but if you do, cigarettes kill. And they cause all kinds of diseases. They rape countries' budgets. So Uruguay passed a law that was basically like Mayor Bloomberg got in New York City, and that many other places in the United States have. You have to label cigarettes. You can't advertise. You basically try to discourage, particularly children, from smoking. Philip Morris is suing Uruguay and Australia, saying it is the basic right of all American corporations to sell poisonous products anywhere in the world. And if you try to change the regulations, you have to compensate us for not killing your citizens. Well, that is a provision that is in the trade agreement, and that provision can be used when Americans try to protect ourselves, our health, our environment, our safety. Foreign companies can sue us, and it will go in a private arbitration without judicial protections, and our taxpayers will have to pay the price.
I want to ask you a personal question.
Was it clear that I was against this trade agreement?
Yes. So I have been reading you, I think, almost as long as you've been writing, and the striking thing is, prescient, I think, understates it. You have been almost clairvoyant in your warnings in the 90s about the wrong kind of globalization. For that matter, in your early academic work about the information asymmetries, the fact that the standard economic model doesn't describe reality, your warnings about excess financialization in the run-up to the crash, your warnings about how the medicine that was administered was saving the banks rather than eviscerating the banks, and now, of course, the role of inequality in prolonging an underperforming economy. So I wonder if being way ahead of the curve early on has left you feeling like a voice in the wilderness? Has it left you feeling affirmed by reality? Has it left you frustrated? Has it left you energized? What?
Well, I suppose the good news is I've lived long enough to see some of the battles that I began won, finally. So you were mentioning when I was chief economist at the World Bank, one of the big battles was about capital market liberalization. These are the regulations that stop capital, short-term capital, coming in and then going out, that create a lot of instability. And to link it back to our theme of inequality, this kind of economic instability almost always hurts the poor the most. And we saw that in the United States, but I saw it in East Asia. You know, you see it over and over again, and we've actually documented that in some of the research I've done. So that kind of instability is really bad for the poor, it's bad for inequality, but it's also bad for the economy. Very clear that capital market liberalization was closely linked with this kind of instability. In September 1997, I was in Hong Kong for the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, and the IMF tried to change its charter to force countries to liberalize their capital markets. And I was a little bit outraged. I was maybe a little naive because I believed that whenever you're going to do a big policy change, first, you shouldn't force countries to do it. And secondly, there ought to be theoretical and empirical evidence that this was a good idea. And the evidence that we had was that it was a very bad idea. In fact, one of the people here at Harvard in the Kennedy School did a study showing that capital market liberalization did not lead to more growth, and we at the World Bank had done a lot of research showing that it led to more instability. So I opposed it, and we were strong enough to stop it getting through this provision getting adopted, but the IMF continued to bang on it. And there were people, including senior people at the IMF, who said I must be smoking things. It got very personal for a while. Well, this is an example where eventually I got vindicated, and after the 2008 crisis, the IMF, in its official position, what they call the institutional position, in 2010, 11, and 12, said, they didn't say, I was right. What they said is capital account management is a good idea. Capital account management is a euphemism for capital controls or for not liberalizing. So they agreed that basically what I have been saying was right. So there's this kind of comfort that if you keep at it long enough, sometimes you eventually prevail.
I want to come back to a question I started asking before about globalization. The kind of globalization that we've had has produced bad outcomes for regular people. Is there a different kind of globalization that would be possible if there were a different kind of politics?
Oh, I think definitely, and there are some countries that have managed to be open and to have, you might call, shared prosperity. One of the things I have had the good fortune to do is I travel a lot, and in different parts of the world, every region of the world. And as I travel around, I get to see, you might call it experiments, different countries trying different things, some with a lot of success and some with a lot of failure. And one of the articles that I wrote that got the most attention in a very strange way. A newspaper article that got over 1 million hits on it, and was about Mauritius. Mauritius, for those of you who don't know, is a small island off the east coast of Africa. It's one of the countries, probably the country in Africa that's had the strongest economic growth. And one of the striking things about Mauritius is that they maintain the kind of social compact that we lost in 1980. So the striking thing is that it's a poor country, you know, but yet they make a choice. And they say, you know, we're a poor country, but within their means, they guarantee a college education for everybody in the country. They have free health care for everybody in the country. And as they put it, they have free public transportation for the young people and for the old. The young people because of their future, the old because of what we owe them. So they've created a society which is not only this kind of sharing, but which is growing faster than almost any of the other countries. So what that illustrated was that there are choices, whatever your income. And the irony is, and I several of the chapters, several of the essays in this book deal with the issue of financing student loans and financing education. And you go back to 1945, some 60 years ago, 70 years ago, and we were a much poorer country then. But even though we were a poorer country, we had a debt GDP ratio of 130%. We had just emerged from a depression and then a World War II. We had put all of our energy into fighting, not into investments in the country. And yet, at the end, we said we could afford to send every person who had fought in the war, which was essentially every young American, or at least every young male, we could send all of them to college for free. And today we say the president puts a timid proposal to have community colleges available for the poor, but doesn't even propose having four-year college for everybody. And he's criticized as saying, oh, you're spending beyond our means. And I think this illustrates so strongly how these are matters of choice. Again, when you look at another example, as you go around the world, another example in how you finance education, and it compares our financial system with finance in Australia. Australia has a system where every student gets an income contingent loan. So he doesn't have to worry about whether he can afford it. He gets a loan, but what he repays is dependent on his income. So if he wants to go into the ministry, I'll mention the next things we're here, or if he wants to go into teaching, he can do it without worrying about the oppression of the loans. Yet in America, student debt now is over $1 trillion. Right. And is actually one of the constraints in the country getting back to robust growth, because so many students have such debt. The average student debt now is when they graduate from college, is $25,000, and many are over 100.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Mauritius, which is known as the Cambridge of the Indian Ocean. And speaking of which, maybe we ought to let the audience in on this conversation.
Okay.
But first, let's thank Joe. Come to the microphones, please, and be succinct.
Thank you. My question is from an aspiring economist from Burkina Faso who lived in my home while he studied. Since I probably won't understand the answer, I'll tell him to watch the video. He asked, what's the future of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in regard to the creation of new financial institutions by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRIC?
Okay, that's actually an interesting question, and it is a little bit linked with what we've been talking about. There has been a failure in global governance. One of the big successes after the Great Recession was the creation of the G20, moving from the G8, G7 to the G20. You know, and President Clinton would come back from a G7 meeting and grouse and say, why am I going to this meeting when all, global problems have to involve China, India, the other major players. The G20 agreed, we thought, to a notion of a recapitalization of the World Bank and the IMF, to a changing in the governance, but the U.S. Congress, the Republicans in the U.S. Congress refuse. So the developing countries, emerging markets, are taking things in their own hand. A little noticed thing happened in September. I don't know how many of you noticed this, that the U.S. became the second largest country in the world. You didn't hear that being celebrated a lot. China, in terms of the way we measure it, called PPP, purchasing power parity, in September became the largest country in the world. But the United States is having a hard time accepting the new global order that entails. Part of the new global order is new governance. So the emerging markets are taking things in their own hands. And part of the reality is that the BRICS, these are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, these 5 countries, their income today is larger than the advanced countries' income in 1944 when the World Bank and the IMF were set up. So and Nick Stern worked with the BRICS and said, look, there are these huge needs in the developing countries' emerging markets. Brent Bernanke had said there's a savings glut. I said that was absolutely wrong. We don't have too much savings. The problem is the global financial system isn't taking the savings and putting it to good use. They were building shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert rather than infrastructure in places where it was needed so badly. So the BRICS got together and created this new institution, new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai. A lot of difficult political problems had to be solved. That got done in a very clever way. Shows when there's goodwill, you can have a solution to these governance problems. And now the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, has been created along the same lines to channel money from the countries where there's savings to where it's needed. This is a new architecture, and I think it's really important. The sad thing is the U.S. opposed AIIB. It was a strategic mistake. I talked to some of the finance ministers in Asia who felt the pressure. They were angry, but in the end, the U.S. lost, and this bank is being established with lots of participation in Europe and Asia. It's really these 2 new institutions will make a difference.
Good evening. My name is Narayani Gupta. I'm a senior at Wellesley College. You talked about how social policy or government policy combined with market forces increased inequality in the US over the past few decades. My question is 2-part. One is that what sort of public action, if any, could reduce inequality? Is it just government policy that you think is the way to go? Second, wages have been stagnant despite increases in productivity. What do you think is the right level of compensation for people? at what point do we say that people are being compensated depending on how much value they're adding to society?
Yeah. On the second question, what is the right, it's sort of like the question of what is the right level of inequality. Nobody who's talking about the inequality debate says we should expects us to get perfect equality. That's not what the debate is. And we don't have to answer what the right level of inequality is, or the right wage level. All we can say is we know we're nowhere near it. And so the likelihood that we're going to have to face that fine-tuning question, do we ought to get a little bit more, we're not going to be there for a long time. I hope we do. And then we can have an interesting discussion about should we have a little bit more, fine-tuning the economy. Right now, the real problem is we have these extremes. We have large segments of our economy that are not participating in the growth. In fact, the majority of our citizens. And this is really an important point. We talk about how great the American economy is, but an economy that doesn't deliver, doesn't lead to increases in standard of living for a majority of its citizens is a failed economy. And I hate to make that judgment, but American economy over the last 25 years is a failed economy. I haven't even described the extent to which our metrics actually don't fully capture how bad things are. So for instance, one of the things that they don't capture is there's more insecurity. That anybody who had a defined pension program where he got some degree of security about what his pension, now they have a defined contribution and those stocks go down, or even if he puts his money in a prudent way in US T-bills, he thought that was prudent. And all he discovers is the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates, so he saved a lot, but he has no income. Now what was your first question?
My first question was if society at large has a role to play in.
Yeah. The main mechanism, I think, because these policies are public policies, are through public action, civic action to try to get the policies changed. Some people say, oh, just let market forces. Market forces don't exist in a vacuum. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. You can't play football without rules and regulations and referees. So every of our activities where you have large numbers of people, you have to have rules and referees and systems that work. And how those rules are set have enormous influence. There are cases, though, where individual civic society action has made a difference, on a global scale particularly. And there are also areas where community action, so you may not be able to solve it at the national level, but cities throughout the United States are doing something about minimum wages. That's a real example. 70% of Americans believe we should raise the minimum wage. We can't get it through Congress. And so what has been going on, and let me just say, our minimum wage is half of that of Australia. And Australia has had fuller employment than the United States. Our minimum wage now is lower than it was 45 years ago, adjusted for inflation. And yet we can't get it passed. And so what's happening? All across the country, cities are getting together and citizens are getting together, and the minimum wage is being raised. And that raises another point that I think is really important to realize. Those on the right said you raise the minimum wage and industry will be devastated, jobs will be lost. No evidence of that. That means the ordinary old-fashioned model of demand and supply isn't quite right. Now, we've known that for 40 years, but we just haven't integrated into our thinking about policy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Thank you for helping to rescue humane economics for me and for your good-humored intelligence and integrity. 3 sentences. Did it start in 1980, as you mentioned, or didn't it start sooner in the early 1970s? What do you make of the analysis of Piketty and the importance or lack of importance of his purported contributions? And are the pundits who continue to this day to say they had to do what they did, they saved the economy, are they correct, or why are they wrong?
Great questions. It actually started before 1980, as Bob pointed out. Carter began the deregulation movement. So, but it went well beyond what he would have done, and the extremes of deregulation that began under Reagan, putting in place as regulators somebody like Greenspan, who doesn't believe in regulation, is a critical mistake. So yes, it did begin before 1980, but it's gotten worse. On Piketty, Piketty's made an important contribution in the following respect. My work and the work of a lot of other people, partly based on work of Piketty and Saiz, had pointed out that inequality since 1980 had grown enormously. Now, before that, there were important studies by a Nobel Prize winner called Simon Kuznets, who had pointed out that as countries get more developed, inequality goes down. And that was called Kuznets' law. And that was based on the fact that actually during the earlier part, from say 1930 through 1980, inequality was going down. What Piketty did is put together these two observations that nobody had mentioned, and that gave a different picture of the American and the world economy. Because what it said was, maybe the period between World War II and 1980 was unusual. The normal state of capitalism is a high level of inequality. So Kuznets didn't see, he saw the downward, but he didn't see the other part, and he misinterpreted what was going on. Now, actually, so the title of Piketty's book was Capital in the 21st Century. If you've been listening to what Bob and I have been saying, my view is that's wrong. That it's not about capitalism in the 21st century. It's really about politics in and democracy in the 21st century. These are not inevitable, the degree of inequality that we have. And in fact, when you look more closely at the data, what you see, he talks about how the wealth-income ratio has increased. If you look more closely at the data, what you see is that most of the increase in wealth has nothing to do with capital. What it has to do with are increases in rents and the capitalized value of rents. So what do I mean by that? If land rents go up and the capitalized value of land goes up, wealth goes up. But just because the value of land in Southampton or in Nantucket or in Martha's Vineyard Cambridge goes up doesn't mean that we're wealthier. Land in the same amount of land in the Riviera today as there was back 100 years ago, but the price has gone up. So that turns out to be very interesting. What you can see is that while wealth is going up, real productive investment actually has not gone up commensurately. So savings was diverted into that rent-seeking activity rather than into productive investment. And that's really the same theme that we've been talking about, and that was a major mistake in Piketty's interpretation of what was going on. On your third question, very briefly, Geithner wrote this book I talk about a little bit in one of the articles. Geithner wrote this book trying to defend what the administration did And you put it very good, we had to do it, and you should be thankful because we saved capitalism. Maybe we saved capitalism from the capitalists, but we saved capitalism. The interesting thing was when people read Geithner's book, which people, the best defense that the administration could put up, and I think the consensus of the reviewers was that he failed. And so my answer as an economist was he couldn't have succeeded. The fact was we didn't need to save the bankers. We didn't need to save the shareholders, the bondholders. We could have saved the depositors, the institutions. And we could have saved it in ways that said, let's go back and remember what the function of why we were saving the banks. That was to lend. But these guys never even asked the banks to lend. They never required it. And for me, I've been involved in the World Bank, and we put all kinds of conditions. When we give money to a country, we put, you do this, you do this. When we gave money to Indonesia, we had, I think, a couple hundred conditions. All I wanted was one condition. You take money from the public, don't give it to your bank officials that had brought the world to the brink of ruin. That doesn't make any sense. Use the money for lending. Geithner and these guys refused to do that. And the result of that was lending to SME years after the crisis was still 20% below what it was before the crisis. No wonder our recovery was so weak. So the answer was what they should have done, rather than relying on trickle-down economics, throwing all the money at the bankers, they should have had trickle-up economics. Save the homeowners, and our whole economy would have been in better shape.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You talked earlier about student loans. So my oldest child is about to graduate from law school with $100,000 in debt. My middle child is applying to medical school and his debt will probably be twice that. We all know about the government cutting back on funding of universities, and we know that they're building bigger sports stadiums and things. Is there any other way to address this crisis? And my second question is, your solution, what country has the best balance between income inequality and quality of life? And are there any problems in economies of scale? Let's say, if your answer in implementing those reforms in the U.S., other than, let's say, single-payer health care or taxes on the rich that could be implemented here. And the third question is, are there corollaries between the wrong-head policies of the IMF and the World Bank is the same type of thinking that has led to the solutions to the financial recession in the U.S.? Would you draw just a few parallels between those, that type of economic school of thought?
Yeah.
And before Joe answers, let me say, we're starting to lose the audience. This was advertised as a 1-hour event, so I think that'll be the last question. We'll be sure to stick around, and Joe will sign copies of your book.
Okay,
Sir.
thank you. So I can't give a full answer to those questions because that would take another 20 minutes, but let me just make a couple comments. I think the student, the way we finance higher education needs to change. Our current model is broken, and there are a number of alternative ways of dealing with it. I mentioned there are two basic frameworks. One is the Australian income contingent loan, where you make a loan and what you repay depends on your income, and the way they do it is making sure that it's never oppressive. The other one is the approach that Scotland has taken. They're saying that education ought to be free. It's a poor country, relatively poor. I mean, it's much poorer than the United States. But they have said it's important, just like Mauritius, it's important for access to education. Now, what is really interesting is talking about elements of choice. In the UK, there are two countries, England and Scotland. England is going the American route, raising tuition fee, making education less affordable. Scotland has gone the other way, trying to make it more affordable. One of the reasons behind the independence movement was exactly that. What was the vision of their society? So to answer your second question, I believe that there are many countries who have chosen an alternative path and have been able to show you can get a higher quality of life for the typical citizen. For the majority of citizens, you can get a higher quality of life and maintain high economic growth. The Scandinavian countries are examples. Now, you ask an important question, can you do this on scale? Absolutely. I believe the answer is absolutely yes. There is no reason why you can't scale this. Obviously, the way you manage it has to be different. You might have systems where you have more local control. You might not want to have the national control that you would have in some other societies. But there is no reason to say, if I would say it goes the other way. In a large country like the United States, we have the resources to provide these basic ingredients of what you might call, what we used to constitute a middle-class society. That we're losing that. We were much poorer 60 years ago, in the 50s and 60s, but yet we were beginning to provide the basic ingredients of a middle-class society. And then beginning in 1980, we started, or I should say, somewhat before 1980, we started walking away from that. And we could go back. And in the end, I think it's the politics, and the ultimate and the hardest question is, how do we change that politics? And that's really where, this coming election is another opportunity that we have to perhaps change the politics.
So the last word is buy the book. Thank you, Joe. Signing books over at that table. Thank you all.
And when you think about criminalized populations and mass incarceration, there is a way in which, it's intimately tied to the wider society. And when you think about just the number of resources that are going into the community to contain threatening groups and contain gangs and contain these populations. So it's not that they are just remote from a particular idea of American society, but they are helping to constitute that idea of American society through the way that particularly police enforcement is undertaken in underserved communities.